All right, welcome to today's lecture. We're going to be talking about testing frameworks today, and I thought it would be fun to, similar to what we did with promises, try and dig into kind of demystify what things like Mocha are doing by just writing the code ourselves, or a kind of a toy version of it ourselves. So I'm just going to jump into that. This is going to be a lot of live coding. We're going to kind of work it out together. And please stop me if you have questions. I will try and keep the chat visible, but I'm on my laptop today, so it may be like behind another window. So if you have a question and want to stop me, just unmute and shout at me and ask questions. And yeah, feel free to ask questions or introduce rabbit trails. I want y'all to get out of this whatever you want to get out of it. So with that said, I am recording, and I will share my screen here, and let's get going. So let's start by looking at some code. First off, can everybody see my screen? Can you see that code all right? Give me just like a +1 in the chat room, or some sort of indication that you can hear me at all. Anyone at all? All right, I'm gonna assume that means yes. Okay, so this is what tests with Mocha generally look like. Got this familiar describe block. So we have a couple of describe blocks here describing different animals, and then tests describing different behavior of those animals. We're not doing anything in the tests. We're just calling done immediately. So this is just sort of simulating a passing test, right? Nothing goes wrong. The test just completes. And then for failing tests, we're just throwing an error. Excuse me. And this might not be super obvious if you've always used if you've always used Mocha in conjunction with an assertion library like chai or console assert or something like that. It may not be super clear, but the way that Mocha works is in these test blocks, the way that it knows a test failed is if an error is thrown. If an error is not thrown, the test is assumed to have passed. So if you're not using an assertion library, you just, hard code in, like throw some errors. So that's what we're doing here. So what we're going to do today is try and write some code that will make this work. We will implement describe and it on our own. So let's look at that. So let's try to get describe and it from somewhere else. We'll just do it somewhere in this same file. Let's call the file it.js. For fun, we'll just stick it in this directory. Okay, so let's go. We're requiring this file now. Let's go look at that file. And let's do it this way. Okay. So on my right is tests.js, and on my left, I've got this it.js file that I'm trying to get describe and it from. So now I got to come over here and actually define describe and it. So let's start with describe. Let's see, describe looks like it takes a name, right? First thing is a string, so we'll call that the name. That's the name of the thing we're describing, I suppose. And then it takes a function. That's this second argument here, is just this sort of inline function. So we'll call that function for now. And then it looks similar, right? That's not what I want to do. I want to create a function named it. And it takes a name as its first argument, always takes that little string, and then it takes some function. So let's call that function again. And then we can come down here, module.exports equals describe in it. So let's see what happens if we do that. I'm gonna node tests.js. I'm just gonna run this test file and see what happens. We don't get any errors, so that's good. That's that's a start. So we actually, these functions exist. So we're calling describe in it at this point. We're just passing in things and doing nothing with them. So this code, these functions never actually get executed. So what we want to do is we want each of these it blocks to actually get run, and we want things to get printed out when the test succeeds or fails. We want to kind of track that. So if we think about it, what's happening is each of these describe blocks, each of these describe calls is creating a new thing, right? It's sort of, it's declaring that there is a group of tests with some name, and the name is what we get in the first parameter. And then the second parameter, this function, is a function that defines all of the tests. So what if we did this? What if we said we were going to take this name. So this describe block gives us the name of a test group. So what if we did in describe, we created a new test group, right? So new test group. So this is some object that doesn't exist yet, but we would sort of maybe create a new test group this way. Maybe it needs the function to. And then we probably want to save a reference to that test group somewhere so that we can access it later and actually run the tests. So for now, I'm just going to create a test groups array in this file. And let's take test groups and push the new group onto there. And then let's just run this function, right? This function that's going to describe all these individual tests for the group. We'll just call it so that code gets executed immediately. And then we just need to describe this test group object, which sort of represents our test group. It takes a name and a function as constructor arguments. And for now, let's just say this dot name equals name, this dot function equals function. So we're sort of creating this object, this test group object, which is going to represent this group of tests. We're doing that because we're probably going to need to hang some functionality off of that later. And then we're just running the function that's passed in, this block here, that's going to include all of our calls to it. So let's start with that. And then in our it block, let's just come down here and log defining the following test name. I'll get some logging in here just so we can see what's happening. And maybe find the following test group. Well, let's run that. Okay, so now we see as it runs through define the following test group, hamster, then it defines the eats test, and then the dog group, and then eats, and then flies. Those two tests. So we're at least covering all of this code now, sort of in the order that we expect to cover it. So that's reasonable. And okay, so now we actually need to execute the code in these tests to actually like run those tests. So And this is where we're going to need to deviate from the format we have over here on the right. So with Mocha, when you're running your tests, Mocha has like an executable bundled with it. So when you run your Mocha tests, the command you're running is actually Mocha. You're not saying node and then passing it the test file. You're actually running a Mocha command that's doing some sort of setup and wrapping for you. And so we may end up doing that as well in the end, but for now, I'm just going to explicitly call a run function at the bottom of this test.js file. So let's define a run function that will actually like kick off the test run after everything is defined. So these describe init blocks sort of define a bunch of tests, and then those tests get run. And with Mocha, they get run sort of implicitly because you're using a Mocha executable that knows to do that after sucking in all of the test files. But here we're just going to call it explicitly for now, which is a little uglier, and we can fix that later, but it's the simpler thing to do. So we're going to export one more function here, run, and name is going to be run, doesn't have any arguments. So what we're going to do is, let's see. So let me back up just a minute. So what we're going to need to do is we have these describe blocks, we're registering those, and what we want to do is when it gets called, when the function it gets called, we want to register these callbacks that get passed in as tests to be run in the context of the current test group that's being defined. So we know that when we define a test group, we're sort of pushing this object onto this test groups array. Test groups, we know are going to have a list of tests. So let's initialize a tests attribute for test group objects that's just an empty array to begin with. And then when we call the it function, what if we created a new test object, new test name function, and then pushed that onto the most recent test group. So the test group that we just created that we're in the context of defining. So what we could say is test groups dot length -1. So we can just get like the most recent test group, get that tests attribute, which we know test groups have now, and just push this new test on there. So if we do that, then when we come to run this thing, let's just log out test groups and see what our data structure looks like. See if we've correctly registered all these things when we call node tests.js. Tests not defined. Okay, so I'm using this object I didn't create yet. Let's create that real quickly. Function test takes a name and a function, and it's probably going to look a lot like this. So initially, this test object, sort of like the test group, is really simplistic. It's just holding data, but eventually we'll be able to add methods to that will actually run the tests and handle test failures. But for now, okay, so now when we hit our run function, it prints out the test group array, and we see we have two test group objects here, the hamster one and the dog one, and each one has an array of tests. And this gets sort of abbreviated, but we can see we have one test in the hamster group, and we can have two tests in the dog group, which is what we would expect. So it looks like all of our tests are registered, right? So now we've taken this code that was written, and we've sort of translated it into a structure of tests, or tests that need to be run, and we've grouped them together. So we're sort of building a data structure that represents our test suite. using these like lightweight test group and test objects. Okay, so that's great, we've got it. But what we want to do is actually run all of those tests and check for errors, right? Because errors that get thrown will tell us that the test has failed or passed. And so we want to be able to run a test. So why don't we create a function on test objects called run to run an individual test. So what would that run function look like? So one thing we could do is just this dot function. So we could just call the function, right? We know we saved the function when the test was created. We could just, when we want to run the test, we could just run the function. Excuse me. The caveat here is that we know that this test will either pass or fail, and we need to figure out whether it has passed or failed. So we're going to wrap this in a try catch block. Try catch any errors. So now, if the test succeeds, then we'll just skip over this catch block. If the test fails for some reason, an error will be thrown, and we'll catch that error. So what should we do here? In the case the test succeeds, we can say this dot state equals passed. We'll call that a passing test. And we'll just change the state of our test object to reflect that this test has passed. And if not, we'll say the test has failed. And we can, maybe we're going to store the failure message. And we can just get the message out of the error and store that in our object. Okay, so this is looking reasonable. So now that we have a run method for each of our tests, when we hit our overall like global run method, we want to loop through our test groups, and for each test group, go through each of the tests and run them. So in a synchronous world, if we did not have to worry about asynchronous code in JavaScript, that would be pretty simple, right? You would just say, you know, test groups dot for each, and you get the group, and then group dot tests dot for each test, and then you could say test dot run. So it's just a nested loop here, right? Like loop through all the test groups, loop for each test in each group, and then call run on that test. And if we do that, we shouldn't get any errors. We don't. And if we logged out here test.name, we see the 3 tests get run. And we could even afterwards here, we could say log test.state. And that should show us the passes and failures, right? So each failed, all the tests are failing. So that's interesting. Why are all the tests failing? Let's look at this dot failure message. Failed undefined. Interesting. Very interesting. Okay. So let's go throw some logging here and log this error directly. Done is not a function. Aha. So all of our first 2 tests are failing because done is not a function. And that is because we were doing this sort of asynchronous thing here, done, where we look for a done callback and we call it when our tests are done. And when we're calling the function here, this is our test, right? This.fn is this function here that got passed into the it. We're not giving it that callback, so we can just give it a dummy callback here that doesn't do anything. And that should clear up that message for now. There we go. So eats, flies, and flies fails with this message, dog does not fly. So now if we come back down here and just log test.state and test.failure message, we'll see that for eats, we get that state is passed and the failure message is undefined. The second one it is as well. For the last one, the test failed and dog does not fly. So this isn't super pretty, but you can kind of see this coming together, and now we're starting to get output that shows us what tests were run, whether they passed or not. But we have a problem here. And the problem is that doing it this way is assuming that all of these tests are synchronous code, that there's no asynchronous code going on in here, which is a pretty poor assumption in JavaScript. So as soon as we have a test that does something like, so let's say if we did this, we said set timeout, and we did our test inside some sort of callback, so now we're going to run into problems. Set timeout is not defined because, ooh, that's even worse. Timeout is how you spell timeout. So now we're getting that flies test shows that it's passed. And then later we get this sort of orphaned error that pops up. Whenever the timeout completes, we get this error about dogs do not fly, but it's not actually failing in the context of the test because these tests we just call test.run, and test.run just calls the function, but it doesn't wait for any asynchronous things to happen. It's not actually waiting for this done to be called to move on to the next thing. So you're going to have to add some asynchronous logic into this to handle that case. So our run method here actually needs to be asynchronous because it's wrapping a test that could be doing asynchronous things. So we could have it accept a callback, but I think what I want to do is have this run method return a promise that will be resolved whenever the test is finished. So let's say we return new promise. If you were in office hours yesterday or you watched the promise video we did a while back, this will look a little familiar to you. I'll reject. And if not, check out the promise video we did a while back on YouTube. But we're going to create a promise by basically wrapping this code in a callback that we're passing into a promise that has a resolve and a reject method. So inside this callback here, we're going to call resolve to resolve the promise and reject to indicate some sort of an error. And then what we can do is, let's create our own done method here because we need one here, right? We've been cheating and just passing in nothing, but we need to define this done method, right? This is going to be what's called when the tests are done. And so what we want to do when the tests are done is, let's put this down here. We already know some of it, right? We want to set the state to passed. And we want to resolve the promise. So that's a good start. And if there's an error, we're still going to catch the error. We're going to set the state to failed in the failure message. And then we're going to resolve the promise here too. Notice we're not going to reject the promise because we've handled this error. We're not going to let this error sort of propagate up. The error is just telling us that the test failed. And as the test framework, that's not a big deal. We expect tests to fail. That's why we have a test suite to let us know when things fail. We want to handle that and be able to sort of print out a reasonable message. So now that run returns a promise, this here isn't going to work. We can't just for each through all the group tests. We need to wait for each test to finish, right? We need to wait for the promise to get resolved to call the next test. And excuse me, what we're going to do to make that work is use a promise library called Bluebird. So Bluebird is just an alternative implementation for promises. It's very much like the built-in promise. You have a node, but it just adds a couple of extra handy methods. And we're going to use one of them in this case. And in this case, the one we're going to use is called, let's see, the one we're going to use is called promise.mapSeries. And mapSeries is basically like a for each for promises. It allows you to give it a list of promises, and it will loop through them, and it will execute some block of code, just like a for each loop would, on the result of each promise, but it sort of does them in order. It sort of waits for each promise to get resolved, and then it sort of iterates through them in order, and then runs some code that you may be running for side effects like we are here. So I can pass in group tests, and I'm going to map through that, and for each test, I'm going to do this stuff down here. I'm going to run the test. In fact, what I'm going to do is, hang on. Yeah, I think this will work. I'm just going to simplify this down to this. Okay. So mapSeries is going to loop through each of these tests and run them. Okay, this is where I'm going wrong. That makes more sense. .map. So let me break this up into 2 lines. This will make more sense. Okay, so first we're going to go through all the tests, and we're going to call test.run on them. And that is going to give us a list of promises, right? Each of these runs return a promise. Each of these promises represents a test, and we're waiting for it to run. And then what mapSeries will do is it'll loop through each of those promises in order. It'll wait for them to complete in order. And then we can print out whatever message we want. And for simplicity, we're going to say that when these promises resolve, they just return the test itself. And that way, down here, we can grab the test after each of the promises, and we can print out something like the test name. Let's start with that. Dogs does not fly, eats, error. All right, so we're got each of those going. Somehow, our test is still getting thrown. So we should be catching that error message, which I believe we are. Oh, right. So this error is happening in a set timeout. Right. Oh. Okay, so this set timeout is a little bit more of a complicated case because the error is getting thrown inside this like set timeout callback. And we need some way to catch that after this it. Let me see. What's the best way to do that? All right, for simplicity, I think we're going to defer that for now and bring this back to this case. We'll start with this and then we can get more complicated later. Eats, flies. All right, so we're running all of our tests. We want to print out whether they've succeeded or failed. And we probably want to do that. So what we can do is, so each test has this state like passed or failed. So each test should be able to also print out a sort of status message, or at least provide us with the status message that we want to print out, telling us sort of its state. So maybe we'll give each of these a toString method that'll take the current state of the test and give us a nice string to print. So return, let's start with this. So we're gonna have some message, which is gonna have the name of the test. Let's do this. So we'll say the message is the name of the test, and if this dot state equals failed, then message is going to get added onto it, the failure message. And return message. And then here, instead of printing test to name, we can print test to string. So now we've got eats, flies, and there's our failure message for flies. Now with Mocha, you get nice green and red indications of whether the test is passed or failed. So let's do that. And to do that, we're going to bring in another third-party library called Chalk. So Chalk is another NPM module that you can use. And Chalk will, is just some, it's a helper library to help you print the special characters to the console that turn on different colors. So it turns out the way that you print like green text to the console is actually first printing some non-printable character that signals like turn on the green color, and then everything that gets printed after that will be green until another special character gets printed to standard out that indicates to turn off the green. And Chalk just does some of that nice stuff for you. So what we can do is we can improve this by saying if this failed, let's see, message equals, and maybe what we need to do is, yeah. Red. So chalk.red will sort of add on to this string the special invisible characters that will tell the terminal to print fun colors. Yay, and now our failing tests are red. And if we wanted our happy tests to be green, we could say, here we go, eats flies. So we got our tests running in the right order, and we've got some kind of nice messages printing out, but what we don't have is anything indicating that these tests are grouped into these describe blocks. So that's just going to be one more step where we know we've got the test groups here, we're looping through them, so we could log out describe group.name, and then we could add some indentation to these individual test strings so that they come in sort of indented. And describe hamster, describe dog. Okay, so now we're getting the describe things printed, but they both print first and then all of the tests print. Why is that? It's because the tests are asynchronous. So as we go through this for each loop, we're going to loop through each block and set up all these promises running, but then they're going to get resolved sort of in their own good time. So we actually need to loop through each of these test groups as well, using promises so that they sort of wait for each other. So this for each is not going to work for us here either, and we're going to need to say promise.series test groups. I think that something like this will work. Not promise. There we go. So we're looping through each of the test groups. And then for each test group, we're returning this other promise of the individual tests, right? And that'll cause this outer map series to wait and finish one describe block for all of the tests in that test group to resolve and before moving to the next one. So now we've got, we've got our describe blocks. It'd be kind of nice if after each of these, we had a little bit of space just to make it a little more readable. That did not work. Then So we're gonna add one more line after we've printed out all of our tests. There we go. So finally, what we're going to want to do is print some sort of summary information, right? You can imagine if we had lots and lots of these tests lying around instead of just 3 and it was scrolling off the page. At the end, we would want to see some sort of summary like Mocha gives you of like, you ran 800 tests and 6 of them failed or something of that nature. So what we can do is we can add methods to the test group to keep track of the test count and test failures. So test count should be pretty easy, right? We know the test count is just this dot tests dot length. The failure count should be similarly easy. However, so we have all these tests, we just need to count all the ones that failed. We know that each test has a status. So we can just go through, and for each test we use the filter method. So filter takes all of the items in an array and it filters out any of them that don't return true when passed to the given method. So filter takes a function and then it passes all the items in an array to that function one at a time. And for each item that the function returns true, that item gets put in the resulting array and everything else gets excluded. So we could say for each of these things, status equals failed length. So we filter out just the ones where status is failed, and then we get the length of that. That should give us our failure count. And so for each describe, let's start with this. We should be able to say group dot test count and dot failure count and log those out. Yeah, so they were seeing 1 test, 0 failures, 2 tests, 0 failures. That's not quite right. There should be 1 failure here. So something about our state is not right. This dot state equals failed. And then for the count, tests, filter, status. See, I'm saying status, but it's actually called state. There we go. So now we're showing 2 tests total, 1 test failed. All right, so we want to just add up all these numbers. So at the end, we see 3 tests total, 1 test failed. And so we come down here, and we can pull this out of there and map series. So this runs each of the test groups, and then at the end, after we've run all of them, we want to finally print out one more thing. So we're going to say at the very end here, we're going to go through our test groups, and we're going to map for each group. We're going to get the test count. So that'll get us an array of numbers. And to sum up an array in JavaScript, without using some special library, the quickest thing to do is usually a reduce. And reduce is a little fancy. but can be super handy. And so the way reduce works is it takes a function and an initial value. So the function I'm giving it is just this function AB that returns A plus B. And the initial value I'm giving it is 0. And what reduce will do is it'll take the initial value and the first element in the array and pass them to this function to get a result. And then it takes the result and the second element in the array and passes that to the function as A and B. And then it gets that result and combines that with a third element in the array. And so it's sort of squashing a long list of things into a single value by just like pairing them off. And so we're using that to start with 0 and just sort of add each subsequent item in the array to a big list. And it's the quickest way to sum up an array in JavaScript. It's not pretty, but it works. Total test count is that. And if we copy that, we could get total failure count. Get the failure count the same way. And we can refactor this code so that it's a little cleaner. But for now, let's just see if it works. And say ran total test count tests. And there we go. Ran 3 tests, 1 failed. So now we're getting some nice Mocha-ish output. The last thing we would probably want to do is add to this message the word it. Sort of the point of the syntax in Mocha where you say it and then a test name is so that your tests read a little bit more like English. So in our test file, we have describe dog, it eats, it flies. And when we print this stuff out, we should see something similar, right? Describe hamster, it eats. Describe dog, it eats, it flies. And we see the error message, dog does not fly. All right, so we got 10 minutes left. The one thing I want to do just for fun here is to bring in expect from Chai. So because we have implemented our test framework, just like Mocha, where if the test throws an error, it just treats that as a failed test, and it uses the error message in the output, we can actually use Chai for this sort of thing. And if we put a Chai expectation in here, expect for to equal cheese, right? So this is a failing expectation. Chai will see that this thing doesn't equal that thing, and it will throw an error with a useful, helpful error message. And so we will get for free in our output expected for to equal cheese. So a lot of the magic that's happening when you're using Mocha and Chai is actually happening in how cleverly Chai is constructing error messages and giving you like syntax for doing assertions. And Mocha is just sort of blindly looking for thrown errors and printing out the messages, just like we are here. So that's a really simplistic implementation of something like Mocha. It's going to break down if we get too more complicated with it. We already saw that if you start like doing expectations in callbacks and those things fail, you have failures happening in callbacks, and we haven't solved that problem yet. That would take a little bit more logic and internal wiring on our part. But for now, in less than 100 lines of code, we have something that works and lets us write something that looks a lot like Mocha. And hopefully that gives you a little bit better idea of like what's going on under the hood and what Mocha is and isn't doing for you. And it's mainly just allowing you to put some structure around your tests and give you sort of a more pronounceable way to make assertions that kind of organize your tests. Are there any questions? All right, well, if there aren't any questions, I will let you guys get back to your day, or out to lunch probably, given the time there. And I'll see y'all around. Thanks for coming.